today I have my acrylic swatch sketchbook out. I have a sketchbook where I just do color mixes, just test out different color mixes, see what I get, just to get to know all my paint colors a little better. And I've almost always used ultramarine blue, but I've owned cobalt blue forever. I've had this tube for quite a few years and I've used some of it, but not a ton, where I've gone through ultramarine blue. So I thought, let's compare, see what the difference is. Should I be using up my cobalt blue? Is my love for ultramarine based in anything? I don't even know. So I'm doing color mixes with each of those. The cobalt blue is an old Winsor & Newton that I've had for quite a while, and the ultramarine is the golden brand. They're all artist colors. And I'm mixing that with quin magenta, which is golden, cadmium red, which is Holbein, cadmium yellow medium hue, which is golden, cad lemon, which is a Winsor & Newton, and I chose one of the browns, red leaning brown, burnt sienna. And then to kind of see what some of the undertones are, I mix with white, and I use titanium white. So let's get started. So first up, a bit of the cobalt blue, and try and do this quickly. Add a little bit of white, get a few different value levels just so you can get a bit of an idea. I'm just doing this really quickly so it's not like a perfect mix by any means. So there you go. There is the cobalt blue. Clean my brush in between. Now let's try the ultramarine. Ultramarine is a lot darker, that's for sure. There you go. Oh, it gets streaky when you're just quickly mixing. So you get a bit of an idea of the difference between the two. And yes, the ultramarine is definitely a lot deeper than the cobalt. Now I've done a bit of pre-mixing so that it doesn't take too long with this video. So we'll do the quin magenta with the cobalt blue. Now this has more quin magenta than the cobalt blue. So you can see what it looks like with more of the magenta, and there it is with a bit of white. Now, quin magenta, again mixed with cobalt blue, but with more of the cobalt in the mix. Nice dark purple, but really a vibrant, energetic purple, I would say. And add some white. There you go. Now let's do the same quin magenta, but with the ultramarine blue. So there's the quin magenta with the ultramarine, but leaning to have more of the magenta. And there it is with some of the white. Now, we're comparing these in this video, but it's not necessarily the equal amount of paint in each of those. So this is just to give you an idea. It's not necessarily going to be a perfect mix of, if you mix the exact same amounts or aimed to get the same color. It's just a quick mix to give you an idea. Okay, so that was the quin magenta, but with a lot more of the cobalt, and let's add some of the white. There you go. Oh, and I'm going to just quickly go back and add a dab of the original quin magenta, just so we have, we know what our starting points were. So add that for both. Now, next up, cadmium red. Put our little dabs. Now, one thing I found when I was doing this cadmium red, doing my pre-mixes, is Cadmium red is a strong color. It takes very little of the cadmium red and it becomes very, very red. So when you're mixing cadmium red with cobalt or ultramarine, you end up, I felt like, having to use a lot of the blue. Let's just add a little bit more white to that. There we go. So that's the cadmium red, leaning fairly heavily to have a lot of the cadmium red in it. So it's just kind of a slightly browned down red, I would say. And this is it with a fair amount of cobalt in it. So it's like almost like a grayish. Well, let's see what it looks like with the white. It gets a lot easier to see what you're dealing with. But it's definitely a neutralized color. Yeah, look how gray that is. Okay, now let's try the cadmium red with the ultramarine blue. Again, it took very little of the cadmium red and a lot of the ultramarine to get what I was looking for. There we go. Now, get the mix with the cadmium red and the ultramarine, but leaning more towards having a lot of the ultramarine in it. And let's get a bit of white to see what we're dealing with. There we go. That's a bluer gray than the cobalt was, but again, keep in mind that I'm not necessarily trying to achieve exactly the same color. Now let's move on to cadmium yellow medium. A little dab of the original. Now on to the mix with the cobalt. So here it is with a fair amount of the cadmium yellow. I found it was kind of the opposite of the cadmium red. Yellow, of course, gets overwhelmed quite easily, so it was a lot easier to mix the darker, or the mix with the more blue than it was with more yellow. But that's typical with yellows. Now let's get the version with more cobalt, and that's a nice green, and quickly just grab a bit of white to see a paler version. And move over to the ultramarine. There it is, leaning more towards the yellow. And grab a little white. A little more white than that. And one more. The darker mix with more of the ultramarine blue and some of the white. There we go. Now move on to cadmium lemon, which is a very bright yellow. And again, it took a lot of the cadmium lemon to get the mix that I was looking to not get overwhelmed by the blues I was mixing in for both the cobalt and the ultramarine. So there is the mixes with more of the yellow than with the blues. So leaning to more of a cadmium lemony color than cobalt blue. And here it is with more cobalt blue and less of the cad lemon. And mixed down with a bit of white. Now, cadmium lemon and ultramarine. Here it is, leaning more towards the yellow. white, a bit more white. Yellows are always so pale to begin with. Okay, now one last mix of the Cad Lemon. This is the color with more of the ultramarine blue. Add some white. There you go. Now for the final mix, I like testing out burnt sienna because I know with blues it mixes quite a nice neutral, or certain blues at least. So let's see how it works with cobalt and ultramarine. So this is burnt sienna with a bit of the cobalt blue. It's still quite a warm brown. Add a little bit of white. There we go. And now here's a version where I added more of the cobalt, and it's a nice, really dark brown. Trying to get some clean white. And there we go. You can see, I called it brown, but once you add the white, it looks quite gray. But definitely a warmer gray than that. You can see that's a very purpley gray. And a test of the burnt sienna with the ultramarine. So again, leaning more toward the burnt sienna. Try to get it without blue. Okay. Burnt sienna mixed with white, or ultramarine and white. And one last mix of the sheet. So this is it mixed with ultramarine blue. Add a bit of white, see what we're actually dealing with. And again, nice gray. So I'm just going to add a little dab of the burnt sienna original color just so I have that. And I'm looking back at the sheet. Clean off my brush one last time. Now, comparing the two, again, we can't compare them exactly because I wasn't, making sure that I was putting exactly the same amount of each color in these mixes. But comparing the two, they're very similar. So really, it's whichever you have, I would say you can go with it. But I probably will still lean towards using the ultramarine blue once I'm used up the cobalt. Maybe I just won't buy it anymore. But just because the ultramarine blue starts out so much darker than the cobalt blue. I mean, the darkest, even if I add a little bit more, it's nowhere near as dark. And I just really, really like that, that depth of the actual blue color. But depending on how you mix or how you paint your color choices, you may prefer cobalt blue. But here you go. Here's a sampling of mixes.